Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. At the time of recording this episode, we are on day 62 of Israel's most recent war on Gaza. The situation is beyond horrific, as over 20,000 Palestinian men, women and children have been killed and 1.7 million have been displaced from their homes. Numerous international humanitarian laws have been broken as civilian areas, hospitals and schools have been attacked and white phosphorus has been used on civilian populations with catastrophic impacts. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Rashid Khalidi, author and historian, about understanding the last 100 years in an attempt to truly understand and uncover what is happening today. We talk about the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the end of British colonial rule in Palestine, the growth of the Israeli colonial project, the ways in which Palestinians have resisted, and so much more. Dr. Rashid Khalidi is Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received a BA from Yale University in 1970 and a DPhil from Oxford University in 1974. He has taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago. He has written or co-edited 10 books, including The 100 Years' War in Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, which we'll be speaking about today. He's written over 100 scholarly articles on aspects of Middle East history and politics, as well as opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the London Review of Books, and The Nation. Rashid Khalidi lived in Beirut and was deeply engaged in Lebanese politics in the 70s and during the Lebanese War of 1982. He's played an active role in peace talks and negotiations in the region in the 80s and 90s, and I'm so honoured he's my guest today. Hi Rashid, thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I think that level of okay, the weightiness in your response says more than anything you could have actually said, apart from okay. I'm so grateful that you've made time to speak to me on the show today. And I think now more than ever, it is so important that we inform ourselves and educate ourselves about what is happening right now in Palestine and in Gaza, but what has happened historically in order to really understand what's happening today and hopefully where we go from here. And your book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, is such an education, and I think it does so much in tackling some of the myths that we've been hearing and really helping people understand that this is not a new issue. And you are a historian, and you've written a number of books and countless articles and journal contributions and whatnot. But this is the first book that you've written that is somewhat personal. The book is semi-autobiographical in that you talk about your own life, you talk about people you know, your family, your wife's family. What inspired you and what really made you add a personal element to this book that you've written that came out actually now in 2020?
A couple of things. The first is that it was so hard to take the amount of misinformation that's in the public sphere. It was so hard to listen to people who should have known better, repeating myths and half-truths and so on. And I wanted to speak to that with a book that was directed at a more general audience than pretty much everything I've written. I mean, most of what I've written is monographs intended for other academics, though I've written some books that were aimed at a general audience. And the second thing was that I kept being pressed, especially by my son Ismail, but also by another relative, a cousin of mine, to write a history of Palestine that was not dry and boring and involved some of the personal things that they both knew, I knew about, family things, historical things related to people I knew, and my own experiences, especially my son, especially Ismail, kept urging me, you tell us about these things that you experienced or that you saw or that your father told you or that your aunts told you. Put these in a book, for heaven's sakes, and that'll make it a better book, and it'll make it a a more approachable, more readable book. He and other people, especially my editor, helped to make it more accessible by constantly pressing me to bring in things of that nature, personal things or family things. I mean, I used a lot of family documents. I used a lot of things that older relatives of mine had told me, things that I'd heard about my grandparents. And I didn't know either of my father's parents, but my father had told me things. One of my older cousins who knew them very, very well, he's 98 years old now, would tell me stories about them. And I had met three of my aunts, and I had actually interviewed them, especially one of them, who was an important historical figure. She played a big role in Palestinian and Lebanese feminist movements. I interviewed her extensively, and I talked to her a lot, and to two of my other aunts. And I put a lot of that in the book, that kind of thing. My mother's reminiscences, my father's reminiscences, my wife's family. My wife's grandfather was the editor of a major newspaper, and so I used his memoirs, which actually my sister-in-law has published now in French. So I used a lot of things that were related to me or to my family or to families that I knew. I used a memoir by someone named Yusuf Sayegh, widow I know, whose son I taught. I mean, things like that I was aware of and that you wouldn't normally find in a history book, maybe. And I hope that and other personal aspects make it both more approachable and I hope more authoritative. I mean, when I talk about my experiences in Beirut, this is what I saw. This is what I and my wife and our two daughters lived through. When I talk about my experiences in the negotiations in 91, 92, and 93, this is what I saw. And I have the documents. And I didn't just, spin out a bunch of reminiscences. In that chapter, for example, about the war, there's a great deal of documentation based on research I've done, research that students of mine have done in some cases.
Well, absolutely. Like the book itself, I think, has about 40 pages of footnotes. Like everything you say, you have backed up with evidence and you have detailed it. So I think, if anyone listening, although you're talking about a book that is more accessible, that is more approachable, that is more personal, it is massively informative. It is still the work of a historian. And I think that really permeates. And I completely agree in the need for literature that is not so dry, that can still really inform and equip people with the information needed. I think, especially in the time that we're living at the moment, almost like the Zionist narrative and ideology and propaganda is so loud and so blatant. I think the very least we can do is educate ourselves enough to differentiate between what is right, what is truth, and what is falsehood. And that, I think, is the first step that that we should be taking. So you open the book with a really interesting, in the introduction, you talk about this letter that is between your great uncle and Theodore Herzl. That's it. Sorry, I wrote it down. Theodore Herzl, who is actually the founding father of modern Zionism, which feels
modern political Zionism. Yes, absolutely.
Which feels a bit surreal to be reading about as something that is like very prominent in your own life. And I just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because it was such like a brilliant point to start the book, because it explained so much as to where this all kind of began.
Right. Well, the letter, the exchange between this great uncle of mine, Yusuf Khalidi, and Theodore Herzl was known. But I thought that it was the right way to start the book, because I think it symbolizes and crystallizes a lot of things that people really don't want to know or hear about Palestine. Yusuf Khalidi was a prominent figure in Ottoman politics, in local society. He had been the mayor of Jerusalem. He had served as the deputy for Jerusalem in the first Ottoman parliament that was elected in 1877. He had taught in Germany, in Austria, in Vienna. He knew foreign languages. He had studied and then he had taught in Vienna. So he was a worldly cosmopolitan figure, very experienced in Ottoman government and in diplomacy and in politics. And at the same time, he'd been mayor of Jerusalem. He built the first modern road between Jaffa and Jerusalem. He was responsible as mayor for the building. So he knew the country. He also knew Zionism because he had lived in Vienna And Theodor Herzl was a Viennese journalist. So I don't know if he actually knew Herzl, but he certainly knew of Herzl. And from materials that he left in the family library, we knew that he was reading about Zionism and reading about Judaism. And so he wrote a letter to Herzl, alarmed at what he was seeing in Palestine in 1899, in which he told Herzl that he understood Zionism. He understood the connection of the Jewish people to Palestine. He understood the persecution of Jews in Europe. I mean, he lived in Europe. He knew how hateful anti-Semitism was in Europe, in Vienna of his day, and in other parts of Europe. But he said, there is a people here already. He raised the problems that Zionism posed. And he said, they won't be supplanted. They're not going to allow themselves to be pushed out. And he ends the letter, for the sake of God, leave Palestine alone. And I thought this was first of all, it showed that people were aware that Zionism was a problem. In 1899, this is 2 years after the first Zionist Congress. This is before extensive Zionist settlement and colonization. There had been Zionist colonization, and he was aware of it, but it's before it took on the dimensions that it took on after World War I and after the Balfour Declaration, after the British took over. The other interesting aspect of the correspondence is Herzl's response, which is completely dismissive, and which raises a concern that Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi had never raised, which is that the Zionists intended to expel the Palestinians. He said, of course, you can be reassured we have no such intention. But he never mentioned that. Obviously, this is something in Herzl's mind, and if you go to Herzl's diaries, you can see that he does intend, not so much to expel them, to use the expression, spirit the penniless population across the frontiers, discreetly. So, he intended to do it, of course, peacefully, but he intended to get rid of the existing population. And I think it's extremely revealing, both of the fact that people were aware of the danger that Zionism constituted to the Palestinians, and that Herzl was, like most Zionist leaders after him, completely dismissive of, and if not contemptuous, of the Palestinians. His response is a masterpiece of evasion, actually, and dissimulation.
Yeah. When I was reading it in your book, it really kind of made me almost chuckle, because now we kind of have this idea that sometimes people just expose themselves, like they tell you something that you didn't even ask of them. They let you know what they're planning without you even thinking that is something that could happen. He was just being asked, just leave Palestine alone, and he was like, yeah, well, of course we wouldn't expel the Palestinians. It just feels so also actually really shocking that, like, to know that it's not an ideology that has sort of morphed over time, and it's not something that has, like, expanded into what we see it as today. This is what it has always been.
It had to have been that. He writes a book called Der Judenstaat, the state of the Jews, or the Jewish state. He writes another book called Alt Neuland. We're talking about Herzl now, in which there are almost no Arabs. So in his imaginary, this was a country which he knew was inhabited by Arabs. He was not foolish. He was informed. He'd visited Palestine, Herzl. Actually, he visited Palestine after this letter, but he knew. At the same time, it's perfectly clear that if you talk about establishing a Jewish state in an overwhelmingly Arab majority land, you are planning to fundamentally change the demography of that country. It is a necessary component of Zionism. Now, if it was established in a completely empty place, which Yusuf Dia sort of refers to, he says, in principle, there's nothing wrong with the idea. The problem is where you want to implement it, which is here, and we are here. And of course, Herzl was aware of that in his own way, and other Zionist leaders were aware of it in their own ways. And they chose to elide that, and to ignore that, and to obfuscate that, and to obscure that, and to lie about that. Because otherwise people would have said, well, wait a minute, you're setting up for this incredible confrontation with the existing population. This is not an innocent plan just to save the Jewish people, which, of course, in a certain sense it was. But it's not innocent in the sense that you have to have malign intentions for this population. One way or
absolutely.
And that's what I think this exchange brings out.
So, over time, I have read of and I have heard a number of Zionist leaders and thinkers make the claim that there is no such thing as a Palestinian in those sure words. And I wanted to ask you to reflect on that, because for me, my understanding is that there's a belief that the people who were living in Palestine were not like Palestinian. They were considered, a lot of them were Muslim, so they were considered to be Arab, and the belief that if you were Muslim, that fundamentally you hailed from Saudi Arabia. There was not this not like an acceptance that the Palestinian people were a people within their own right. But to me, it doesn't really make sense. But I have heard it and I have read it over time. We have heard this, and you just like, well, look, they're there. But I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on where exactly that statement comes from, and just like how harmful it is.
Well, I mean, it comes out of ignorance, and it comes also out of a desire to pretend that this is a land for what's the expression? People without a land for a land without people. In other words, you're not replacing somebody. There's nobody there. It's a terra nullius. I mean, that's the ideological, but it's also driven by ignorance. There was no Israeli people in 1899.
Yeah.
Most Jews rejected Zionism until sometime in the mid 20th century. They did not think of themselves in modern nation state terms, nor did most people in most of the world in the 19th century. And this is certainly true of the Arab world. I mean, it's based on a gross ignorance of how nationalism develops and what nationalism is. People believe the myths of nationalism. You know, the French have been there since Vercingetorix and since Joan of Arc. No. Modern French nationhood is a product of late 18th, late 19th, 20th centuries. So are all nationalisms. People saw themselves in religious terms. People saw themselves in dynastic terms. You were an Ottoman subject. You were a Habsburg subject. You may have had a language, and you may have seen yourself as a Czech, or you may have seen yourself as a Slovak, or as a Hungarian, or as an Austrian. That was peoplehood. That did not define your national status, because there was no such thing as a nation state in most parts of the world until the 19th and 20th centuries. That's certainly true in the Middle East. It's also true of Zionism. Zionism creates the idea of a modern nation state in the midst of a people who saw themselves essentially in religious terms. So was there a Jewish people? Of course there was. But was that a people that demanded to live in a nation state under sovereign authority only of Jews? No, nobody believed that. And in fact, the idea of speeding up the messianic return to Zionism, to Zion, to the land of Israel, was opposed by the entire religious establishment, rabbinical establishment. It was blasphemy. This was something that would happen in God's time, the return of the Jewish people. It was not something that a Herzl or a Weizmann was supposed to accelerate. And in fact, religious authorities were generally quite anti-Zionist until sometime in the mid 20th century among most Jewish communities. So this idea of peoplehood existed. You know, the idea there's an Arab people, or the idea that the Turks have an ethnic identity. Those things existed, of course, before. But Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, they existed as places. People in Palestine believed they lived in Palestine, but was their national identity subsumed within Palestine alone? No, it wasn't. To be very frank, it wasn't. There was a sense of Palestinian identity even before World War I. You have newspapers like Palestine, which is the paper founded by my wife's grandfather, Isa Palestine. So the place, the sense of the place, the sense of identity is there. But this as the exclusive national identity, no, that's a new idea. That's a late 19th, early 20th century idea. Actually, among Zionists, as among Palestinians or Lebanese or Jordanians or other peoples in the Arab world, those modern senses of national identity come on top of existing senses of peoplehood. But Egyptians thought of themselves as part of a Muslim ummah, thought of themselves as part of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't think of themselves as we are Egyptians and therefore we have to live in an Egyptian nation state. That idea actually only arises in the 1880s in Egypt. Masr al-Masriyin, Egypt for the Egyptians. That's a national idea. 1882. It almost doesn't exist before that. And the same is true really all over this region. And also for Jews. I mean, the irony is Zionists are claiming Palestine didn't exist. Well, Israel didn't exist either. The idea of Israel as a nation state didn't exist. Israel as a people, yes, it did. The idea of Arabs as a people, other peoples, those existed. But that your political identity should be shaped by that? No. Most cases, your political identity is shaped either by dynastic or by religious or politics or by both.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But if if the concept of a nation state came late into the 20th, 19th, 20th century, even in the face of the newly accepting what nation states are, for Israelis or Zionists to turn around and say, even though we know what a nation state is or we know what political identity is, even in the face of that, there is no such thing as a Palestinian.
Well,
It
I know
feels. Mm,
they don't look at the history. They don't want to look at the
yeah.
history. You have these
Mm,
conferences in Palestine in 1919, 1920, 21, where they say we're Palestinians,
mm,
where they're putting forward petitions to the League of Nations or to the Peace Conference in Paris or to the
mm,
British government, where
mm.
they assert we're Palestinians. So, I mean, what do you want more than that? They don't know
Exactly.
ignorance. I say to you, complete ignorance and malevolence, a desire
Yeah.
not to see the other because that's seen as contradicting your existence.
Mm,
I mean, Palestinians have the same problem with Israelis. Well, they're
yeah.
settlers. Yes, of course they're settlers. But settler colonial projects produce national entities eventually. I live in one. I live in the United Nations state. There's an
So do
American
I.
people, but
Yeah.
it's a settler colonial project. I mean, you can hold, you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and a lot of
Mm.
people don't want to understand that.
Yeah, and actually, like on the use of the word, like a colonial project or colonial power or colonial state, I think it's really important that we start to use that more to explain what Israel is. And I mean, you talk about it so well in the book, actually. And I think there's a part of us that feels like, but we're kind of living in a post-colonial world, in the sense that at least the British Empire is kind of falling apart now, and we've seen the decolonization in that sense. But there seems to be a reluctance to use
Yeah,
that word to explain it. But as you describe it in your book, it's not an opinion, it's a fact.
yeah.
And if you could just quickly just explain exactly why we should be calling Israel as it is, which is a colonial project.
Well, to start, because that's how early Zionists saw it. I
Mm,
mean, to be very blunt,
mm,
colonialism only takes on a bad odor after World War II with
mm,
the decolonization project in India, in other parts of the formerly colonized world, as the European powers are forced to release their hold. Until that time, colonialism is a good thing. Colonialism is accepted. And settler colonialism, where superior races take over places from inferior races, is the way of the world. And Europeans saw themselves as having the right to do things to non Europeans, including taking their place if necessary, sometimes to rule over them, as in India or Egypt, and sometimes to take their place. Zionism fits into that mind frame. They saw themselves as the original masters of the land, but they saw themselves as coming as Europeans to take over this land from this backward population and to transform it into what it once had been, i.e., ancient Israel. And they used that term freely. So one of the major land purchase agencies is called the Jewish Colonization Agency. This is
mm,
not an anti Semitic slur by a bunch of anti Israel bigots. This is what they
mm,
called themselves. You have Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, saying, we will create a wall for Europe against the barbarism of Asia. I mean, he believed and thought in colonial terms, and they
mm,
operated as colonists. They talked about these places as colonies. They talked about themselves as settlers. So that was the self view of the Zionist project right up to World War II. Now, they
mm,
had a falling out with the British in 1939. And they then started posing as anti colonial. We fought the British for 4 or 5 years. Of course, they had helped the British fight the Palestinians for 20 years before that, but
mm.
never mind. And it continued to have that settler colonial name. What is settler colonialism? It's replacing one population with another population and
Yeah.
taking their land. Okay? You have, regular pith helmet colonialism, where the colonial power comes in and rules over another people, Egypt, India,
Mm,
Nigeria. You're not bringing an English population to replace the Indians. You're not bringing an English population to replace the Nigerians. In Canada, in Australia, in the United States, in the 13 colonies, in New Zealand, Algeria, and so on, you are bringing in a
mm,
European population to replace as much as possible the indigenous population, sometimes completely, as much, almost completely, Canada, the United States, Australia, sometimes only to a certain extent,
mm,
Algeria. And that's what Zionism is a settler colonial project in that sense. It means to, in the words of one of the early Zionist leaders, Vladimir Jabotinsky, transform Palestine into the land of Israel. And it does that both demographically and in terms of control of land. That's what settler colonialism is all about, setting up legal regimes where you can take over the land and squeezing the people into either smaller and smaller spaces, the indigenous population, or pushing them out, which is what Israel has been doing systematically ever since 1948. They expel 750,000 people in the Nakba of 1948. They expel another 250,000 people after the 1967 war. And we see them squeezing the population of Gaza into smaller and smaller parts of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and possibly attempting to expel them from the Gaza Strip into Egypt. There certainly was thinking along those lines, and there still apparently is some thinking along those lines. So the point is, there is that continuity in terms of demography and in terms of land, not only before 1948, but also in terms of how Israel treated the areas that it took over in 1948. There would have been 900 or 950,000 Arabs in the 78% of Palestine that the Israeli army ends up in control of. 600,000 Jews and 950,000 Arabs. It wouldn't have been a Jewish state. You had to push them out, and they did. So you ended up with about 100, 150,000 Arabs and 650,000 Jews by the end of the 48 war. And then you bring in as much immigrants as you can, and you change the population. So it's those demographic and land, and they stole all the land, by the way, not all, almost all. Everything that was left behind becomes absentee property. The state takes it over, custodian of absentee property. And the existing Palestinian communities are squeezed into smaller and smaller space, and much of their land is appropriated. So that's how settler colonialism works, and how it worked in the Western Plains in the United States. It's how it worked in Australia. Legal stratagems whereby control of land is transferred from the native population, the indigenous, to the settler population, and demographic pressure to decrease the indigenous population and increase the settler population. I mean, if you don't see Israel in that way, you're not seeing reality, in my view. This is not a, what's the word? A theory. It is the only possible explanation, in my view, of the whole process of settler colonialism. Zionism is different than other settler colonial projects for multiple reasons. First of all, it has its own independent national ambitions. Most settlers come as an extension of the population and the sovereignty of the mother country. French settlers don't go to Algeria to set up a French Algeria. They go to Algeria to set up, to extend France, as it were. And the same with English settlers. They came to North America for that reason. We are here on behalf of the crown. And we are here as an extension of the population of Great Britain. And that's true with all colonial ventures, except Zionism. Zionism had its own independent national ambitions. So it's quite different. The means and the method are settler colonial. The ambitions are quite different. I mean, they're in a transactional relationship with the imperial power, which is Britain. Whereas most colonial populations are there as they're sent out by the mother country, and the mother country protects them and extends its sovereignty through them. So it's fundamentally different in many, many ways. There's also the biblical connection. I mean, there is a connection between the Jewish people and Judaism and Palestine, a historic connection. I mean, Judaism begins there, and there have always been Jews living there. So it is obviously fundamentally different than, say, South Africa, or different than, say, Algeria in multiple respects, even though it shares some of the common characteristics, demographic, land expropriation, and mentalities.
Yeah, I mean, so the last point you just made about it being different because it's not like an extension of an existing nation that wants to expand territorially, which is true because there is no beginning country of Jewish people or Zionists that wanted expansion, there's no mother right? There's no other country. But obviously, there has been historically, which is why the Balfour Declaration was even signed in 1917, support and sympathy for a Jewish national home,
right?
Like a Jewish state. And this is obviously way before the Second World War and the Holocaust, right? So, and I know a lot of people sort of clutch onto the Holocaust as being a reason, or this is why the Jewish people need
a justification,
exactly,
for the establishment.
But we're talking about 40, 50 years before that, right? 30, 40 years before that. What exactly Why? Yeah, why exactly was there so much support for a Jewish state back in the early 20th century?
Good question. First of all, there is no mother country. That's correct.
Hmm.
But there is a metropole. Every
Hmm.
colonial endeavor has to have a metropole. The metropole is the United States and Western Europe. Is now,
Hmm.
has always been. And that's why Herzl shops the idea around to the German Kaiser and to the French
Hmm.
and to the Ottoman Sultan. He needed a backer, a sponsor, a metropole for this colonial project. Finally, Weizmann finds that metropole in England, in the British government during World War I. Why is there sympathy for this idea in Britain? Two basic reasons. The really important one is strategic, but the other important subsidiary reason is religious. In Britain, among British Protestants, there was a awakening, it's called. There was a religious revival in the early 19th century, which you see to this day among Christian evangelicals in the West, who saw the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel as a duty incumbent on Christians in order to speed the coming of the Messiah.
Hmm.
And have people like Lord Shaftesbury and other prominent English figures in the early 19th century are advocating this idea. So the idea has a religious, if you want, root in a certain modern interpretation by Protestants, evangelical Protestants, of their own religion. It has nothing to do with Judaism. And it has
Hmm.
nothing to do with Jews, actually. They're an instrument to bring the Messiah closer.
Hmm.
We
Isn't it
always,
actually?
pardon me?
Isn't it actually in that sort of a religious viewpoint that is actually the downfall of the Jewish
Yes.
people anyway, and
After
that they
the
will
Messiah
be
comes,
condemned to hell? Yeah.
believers will either accept Christianity or burn in hell. Yes.
Mm.
That's not the point. Let's get to the
Mm.
other most important reason. The most important reason for the British was strategic.
Mm.
Long before the Balfour Declaration, at least a decade before, the British had become concerned with two things, two strategic factors. The vulnerability of Egypt to attack from the east. Why is Egypt important? It has the Suez Canal. It's the
Mm.
connection with the Indian Empire and Britain's East African and Southeast Asian empires. It's
Mm.
absolutely vital to the British Empire. And they're become aware from 1905, 1906 of the vulnerability of Egypt to a potential attack from the east. And they must protect the eastern frontier of Egypt. In fact, Egypt was attacked from the east in World War I. They were right.
Mm.
They did need a buffer. And so for them, Palestine is a necessary buffer. So that's the first
Mm.
strategic factor. The second strategic factor is they become aware in 1909, 1910 of the fact that the shortest land connection between the Gulf and the Mediterranean runs through Palestine. In other words, the talk in that period is of a railway. And later on, when the British take control of that area, that's what they're doing in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. If you look at the Sykes-Picot Agreements of World War I, there's this stretch of land running across from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. The British want to control that from much, much earlier for
Mm.
strategic reasons. They control the shortest sea route to the Suez Canal. They want to control the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf, and therefore between their possessions in Europe and the Middle East, and between their possessions in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Africa. Eventually, they build a pipeline, air bases, and a road running from Haifa across to Basra to execute that vision. And they control that entire area through Jordan and through Iraq and Palestine between the wars. So those are the real reasons why they see Palestine, in the words, and the Zionist project, in the words of an English colonial official, as a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabs.
Yeah.
So for them, it's an anchor for
Mm.
their strategic needs, and it's an outpost, a settler colonial outpost in the middle of a hostile population, like the Ulster plantation was for the
Mm.
kings of England and for the later on British kings. And this is Ronald Storrs, who's the military governor of Jerusalem. He puts that in his memoirs. That's his term.
Mm.
It's not my term.
Mm. Yeah. So 1917 was when kind of like obviously Britain. So Britain, the first shock was that Britain kind of took control over Palestine, and then decided that they were going to allow or permit Jewish populations to move into Palestine.
Encourage, not
Um,
just permit.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And then obviously Britain didn't stay in control. Britain left in 1948 or
Correct.
7.
It,
So my question to you is, when they left in 1948, what was that like? Because I know Britain leaving its colonies has been absolutely chaotic and
right.
bloody
It was
and ill thought out. And if you could just talk us through what exactly happened in Palestine when they left.
ironically, when the British leave many places, they leave chaos and partition. India,
Yes.
obviously,
Yeah.
Cyprus, obviously,
Mm,
Ireland, obviously, and Palestine, obviously.
mm,
In many cases, these are partitions that they themselves carry out. In the case of
mm,
Palestine, it was the United Nations that carried it out. The British decide to leave Palestine in 1948 because there's been a rebellion against them by the Arabs in the late 30s, and then there was a rebellion against them by the Zionists after 1939. And they're about to lose their Indian empire in 1947, and they've decided they're leaving India by this point. They cannot maintain control of India, and that was the logic behind Palestine in the first instance, to
mm,
control the route to India. Well, you don't have India. The route to India has a different meaning. And
mm,
they had no capability to sustain their position there, given their diminished post World War II position economically, militarily, and so on. So they give it up
mm,
for strategic reasons, for economic reasons, because they're war weary, and they hand it over to the United Nations. The United Nations partitions the country, which at that point has an absolute Arab majority of over 65%. And they give most of that country to the Jewish minority for a Jewish
mm,
state. So
mm,
a population which believed that under the United Nations Charter and under the Covenant of the League of Nations they had a right to self-determination is being told, no, you do not have the right of self-determination in your country. Indeed, a minority in your country is going to get most of it. And the Palestinians
mm,
obviously rejected that for understandable reasons. And then were overwhelmed by the power that the military power that the Zionists had built up with the aid of the British starting in the 1930s, and which they turned against the British briefly, but which they then used with full force against the Palestinians. And the result of that was the Nakba, the flight, expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from Palestine before and during the 1948 war.
yeah. So historically, obviously, or how did the Palestinians react to the in sort of 1917, when Jewish people were being encouraged to move into Palestine, but also then later on as these were formalized and there were people forced out?
Right.
How over time have Palestinians reacted and resisted?
They reacted against the British and the Zionists in the interwar period. First of all, mainly via boycotts and demonstrations and petitions and processions and letters and delegations, completely fruitlessly. And eventually they rose up in revolt. The British suppressed that revolt mercilessly, as the British always did everywhere,
Hmm.
killing, wounding, imprisoning, and exiling between 14 and 17% of the Palestinian adult male population. That
Hmm.
crushed the Palestinians. Their leadership was dispersed, either exiled or killed or imprisoned. And they never really recovered from the British crushing of their 36 to 39 revolt. They were therefore in a very weak position when partition took place. Conflict began between the two communities, and eventually the Zionists overwhelmed them. At
Hmm.
that point, hundreds of thousands of refugees had been driven out by May 15th, 1948, when the mandate ended and
Hmm.
the British left and the state of
Hmm.
Israel was established. The city of Jaffa had fallen to the Zionists, and people had been expelled, 70,000 people. The city of Haifa had fallen to the Zionists, and 60 or 70,000 people had been expelled. Other
Hmm.
cities had fallen, and many, many tens of villages. And so you already had 200,000 or 300,000 people, probably more than 300,000 people who had been expelled, arriving penniless and destitute in Arab capitals. And the Arab
Hmm.
countries responded and sent troops into Palestine, who were eventually defeated by Israel. And so
Hmm.
you ended up having a refugee population of 750,000 scattered around either host countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, or living inside Palestine. Some of them in
Hmm.
what became the Gaza Strip, and some of them in the West Bank. And
Hmm.
they responded to that eventually by a revival of their national movement, but much later in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, one of the sort of arguments or I know one of the things that we get told a lot is that, like Palestine has not been historically open to peace talks and agreements.
Yeah,
And actually, you've been involved in peace talks over the years as well. And I wondered if you could just shed light on actually what has been the case
right.
historically.
Well, the expression we often hear is the Palestinians rejected
Mm,
generous offers and walked away and didn't want peace, which is absolute balderdash. It's complete and utter nonsense. If by a generous offer you mean the offer of a sovereign, independent, viable, contiguous Palestinian state, that was never on offer. Now, the United Nations offered an Arab state, which was less than half of the country.
mm,
The Jewish state under partition would have been 55% of the country. The Arab state would have been 42%, and then there would have been an international corpus separatum in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. But in the talks with the Israelis, which the Palestinians did engage in from 1991 right up to the early 2000s, there were several Israeli offers made. Were they generous offers? Well, Rabin said, we will offer the Palestinians less than a state. This is his last speech before the Israeli Knesset in 1995, just before he's assassinated. The Palestinians will get less than a state, and we will control the Jordan River Valley, which means Israel will maintain control over the Palestinians. So no sovereignty and no statehood. I mean, you'd have a Bantustan, you'd have an autonomous zone, you could call it whatever you want, under Israeli security control and under effective Israeli sovereignty. So that was not a generous offer. From an Israeli point of view, it might have been a generous offer, but from the Palestinian point of view, we're sovereign people, we should have sovereignty. We should be equal to you. No, we're going to get a subordinate status to you. Well, that's what the Palestinians already had. And that's all that Israel ever offered, in fact. Later on, there were negotiations at Camp David in 2000. And another Israeli Prime Minister, Barak, made an offer, which again, on various issues, was not generous. Each of these represented a move forward of the Israeli position. But to categorize it as generous is an arrogant and condescending view of the Palestinians. The Palestinians should accept whatever they're lucky enough to get. They're an inferior people. We will have complete sovereignty, and you can have reduced sovereignty. Well, that's not generous. Sorry. I mean, generous would be an equal division of the country on a basis of equality.
Absolutely. And I just wondered if we could take a moment just to talk very briefly about the labeling of Hamas as a terrorist organization. Now, we don't need to go into the history of like how it's evolved over time, but I'm actually really intrigued by the use of the word because it seems like, and I think I mean, I've heard you speak about this before as well, like we're very quick to label groups as terrorist organizations or, with terrorist agendas.
Right.
But we don't do the same. We don't apply it to states.
I mean, that's what I would say. I think you've summed it up. If the targeting of civilians is categorized as terrorism, then both state actors and non-state actors have to operate according to the same standard. I personally would use terms like violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think you can argue if you accept international humanitarian law, you don't have to. And it didn't exist before World War II. I mean, it's created in response to World War II. So what happened in World War II maybe were war crimes, Hiroshima, Dresden. But that law didn't exist. It's created in response to the horrors of World War, the Holocaust, and some of the other things. The term terrorist is a loaded ideological term, essentially used by states to describe their non-state actors. Violations of international humanitarian law, which involves any attack on a non-combatant. A non-combatant is someone who's not carrying a weapon. And I would argue that that's the terminology that should be used. Violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes. And in that case, you apply the same standard to both what Israel does and what Hamas does. And I think you can see targeting of civilians on the one side and you can see targeting of civilians on the other side. But you have to use the same standard. If this is terrorism, then that's terrorism. And I think it's an ideological term used only by one side to diminish and to, demonize its opponents. I mean, is the bombing of Shuja'i with 2,000-pound bombs that kills 100 people in order to kill one member of Hamas, disproportionate, which is the standard in terms of international humanitarian law. Obviously, it is.
Mm.
Well, that's a
Mm.
war crime. Is the
Yeah.
killing of Israeli civilians with no military purpose visible? That would also be a war crime. If you accept international humanitarian law, you don't have to. I personally do. I think that is a standard to which both states and non-state actors should be held. That's my own personal view.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the issue of the violation of international humanitarian law, we're seeing so much of it at the moment in Gaza. We're seeing the use of white phosphorus, we're seeing the targeting of civilian locations and
Right.
hospitals and schools. And it feels, and obviously, like it is being labeled by the UN and other agencies almost in those terms and often in those terms as well. But it feels right now like it's just words being thrown around.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Unfortunately.
What do you think? Do you think that there will be a time that it's not too far away that that this might be addressed? Because I don't want to, historically, I don't want to think 100 years from now there will be like a retrospective trial of Israel. What are we going to do 100 years from now when everything's been obliterated? Do you think? What do you think in terms of the short to medium term, in terms of hope?
I mean, you've asked me a question I can't answer. I'm a historian. I can't predict the future, and I won't.
Yeah, of course.
The balance of power globally today is such that the United States can prevent certain things and can't prevent certain things. And the United States is completely aligned with Israel on this and many other things. So the possibilities are limited. However, there's an international criminal court and there's an international court of justice. And they're not entirely subject to the influence of the United States and Israel. I think you would need a much more forceful prosecution than has been the case up till now because of the feebleness of the Palestinian Authority, its complete fecklessness, its subordination to and control by Israel to a very large extent. Those are all reasons why this hasn't been pursued as it should be. And also because I don't think an international consensus has developed yet around if it were to develop and were to isolate the United States, as I think it could, I think things might change. But that depends on a lot of ifs.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Rashid.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Rashid, thank you so much for your time today. This has been so interesting and also really hopeful as well. And I really hope that people pick up your book to learn more and really understand the 100 Years War on Palestine that I really hope we see an end to